I'm Hindol Gupta. This is Global Order. My guest today is someone who's just written a wonderful new book. Ambassador Ajay Bisaria was our man in Islamabad, one of the toughest postings, it is said, in the Indian Foreign Service. He's now out with a particularly interesting book. Remember, Ajay Bisaria also has many, interesting anecdotes and stories in his book. But one of them, of course, is when he was actually in a tit for tat measure thrown out of Islamabad, as India did the same in a moment of great crisis. He talks about that. He talks about Pulwama and much more in his book. We want to discuss, of course, India and Pakistan with him, but also we want to touch upon what India and Pakistan relations and how they extrapolate, in a sense, across the world in other manifestations. For instance, in the Khalistan issue with Ambassador Bisaria. Thank you, sir, for joining me.
Thank you, Hindol. Thank you for having me here.
Congratulations on the wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and the book is just about 4 months old in the market. So it's been a pleasure having conversations around it.
I want to begin by asking you a question, sir, which I have often thought about from the days of my IR classes, so to speak. Uh, why do we in India-Pakistan relations traditionally undervalued coercive diplomacy and consistently, some would say, overvalued a sort of, some project it as statesmanship, you know, perhaps sometimes it's merely cowardice, sometimes it's genuinely an effort to sort of build bridges, but all kinds of measures, but not enough coercive measures, coercive diplomacy in our long history. What is the issue? Do you think? Is it because for a long time, there was a sort of parity between the two nations? Were we not confident enough to have the upper hand? Why is that aspect of our relationship from India's side so undervalued and indeed underappreciated?
I think it's a very important question to ask ourselves. And this is one of the central propositions I make in my book after having examined the sweep of the 76 years of the relationship. And that is certainly that while diplomacy is important, there is space for diplomacy, there are also limitations to diplomacy. So nation states should be able to maximize their interests, should be able to deploy instruments of hard power or of coercive diplomacy in achieving their objectives. And certainly in the case of India and Pakistan, I make the argument as well that if you look at the sweep and with perfect hindsight, we did not have an answer after the 1971 war to the kind of proxy warfare and the kind of terrorism we face from Pakistan, all the destabilizing proxy warfare that we saw in Punjab in the 80s, in Jammu and Kashmir in the 90s, all over India in the 2000s, like the Mumbai attack and so on. We failed in our early years to set up a credible deterrent. And if you will, we perhaps had an over-reliance on, call it diplomacy, statesmanship, or whatever, and an under-reliance on hard power, which would have set up a credible deterrent and sent a message to Pakistan in its strategic calculus that the pathways of proxy warfare and of terrorism, increasingly implausibly deniable terrorism, they thought it was plausibly deniable, was not an option. So I think by doing what we did in 2016 and 19 in terms of the surgical strikes and airstrikes, India has set up a credible deterrent of sorts for terrorism, or at least an assurance of retaliation in case of spectacular terrorism, which is what I think we should have done much earlier, several decades earlier.
One of the problems that coercive diplomacy has in India, perhaps that is changing in the last few years, as you pertinently point out, Ambassador. In India, the problem is that we've never had a culture of a security. Understanding of security in the public discourse. Security or sovereignty was something that was far away from ordinary lives. People did not think India's sovereignty, at least in the public discourse, was something that really needed to be valued and worth fighting for, in a sense. Somehow that security culture has never really seeped in. Perhaps that's changing, as I said, but was never really prevalent for a long time. Why do you think that's true? Is it because we still don't have, even till date, a framed national security policy, for instance?
I think, if you look at strategic cultures, perhaps there can be an argument, you could make an argument that uh, India's strategic culture is of status quoism and of preserving the status quo in terms not just territorially but otherwise. And what we've done is, I think, over at least in this century, and certainly with the 1998 moment when we went nuclear, we moved to a more realist strategic culture, which allows us to weigh the options, the security concerns, and take on more realist positions, and not be shy of deploying the instruments of power. So I think it is important for a rising state to be able to do that. And particularly because of the peculiar circumstances India finds itself in. India lives in a tough neighborhood with two adversarial neighbors with whom India has fought wars, both China and Pakistan, and a couple of dysfunctional neighbors as well, Afghanistan and Myanmar. So security should be a strong focus of India's concerns, because India needs that security, needs that stability to achieve its aspirations of economic prosperity.
I want to put to you, Ambassador, that today we talk about a sort of, in a sense, a far more assured voice in India's diplomacy, perhaps a far more aggressive voice, even some would say, with Mr. Jaishankar, and of course the coming of the Modi era, so to speak. But correct me if I'm wrong. In a sense, that began also in some ways. In some ways, also when Jaswant Singh wrote that famous essay in foreign policy, where he argued that India would not stand for nuclear apartheid again. I mean, we all, again, read that essay in college, in our IR classes. But was that the pivotal moment then? Was that the moment when things began to change, at least publicly? Some people would say, even in Mrs. Gandhi's time, on many instances, India took a forceful stand, not least in the case of the Bangladesh Liberation War. But at least in the face off with the West, in a sense, was that the turning point?
I would argue that, while India, in terms of leadership, in terms of national position, did display the capacity in 1971 of being a tough nation, of defending its interests without hesitating to use force. Uh, the real moment when all this entered the public discourse, and there was a public conversation about it, and a more democratic conversation about India's positions vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis its neighbors, came after 98, after the nuclear explosions. And after turning nuclear, India, the discourse, of course, from the political leadership was that this needed to be a nuclear responsible India. But I think it also had the effect of having a wider discourse on this issue, of questioning some of the Western assumptions about India. And I think, of course, you've seen in recent times an acceleration of the process. You might argue that this has something to do with the economic standing. The confidence comes both from economic prosperity or relative economic prosperity and from decisive leadership, which I think you need to have all those circumstances coming together for a more confident and forward-leaning foreign policy posture.
Talk a little bit about Pakistan now, and where Pakistan finds itself in a sense. This is an interesting moment for Pakistan. A lot of people feel the beginning of the end, in a sense, is near. But actually, in recent months, some slivers of bouncing back of the Pakistani economy has happened, which is why we saw this rather interesting moment in the recent past of Pakistani businessmen, pushing political leaders to, in a sense, do business with India again. But we've seen this kind of thing before. I used to work at Fortune, where we wrote about Mia Mohammad Mansha, for instance. Pakistan, that time Pakistan's biggest businessman, and his ideas of how business with India could really transform things. And there have been many such stories that have come out in the past. Do you think there's anything different this time, Ambassador? Do you think there is, or is this more of the same, more of the usual? Or do you think that, especially because CPEC seems to have got grounded in some senses in many ways, and it's not taking the shape and form that perhaps both China and Pakistan wanted, and already the Pakistani economy is extremely shaky. This is, in a sense, a cry for help.
I would argue that some things have changed because, as you mentioned, this has been a sort of historical position. We've seen at multiple points in the relationship a primacy to the trade discussion and a kind of attempt to go ahead with trade. But in the past, there was often a Pakistani posture, which was strongly ideological in the 80s and 90s, which said that, trade is an Indian issue. And it is an attempt to dilute the fundamental Kashmir cause, which is the fundamental issue between the two countries. So often there was a suspicion with which the Pakistani establishment would look at a conversation on trade with India, even if it would permit it. And that was done in the comprehensive dialogue. You would remember there were 8 tracks to that, and trade was one of them. But I think something has changed at least from 2021, as Pakistan confronts a polycrisis, which is largely an economic crisis, which is the accumulated sins and errors of 70 years of mismanagement of the economy now beginning to express themselves. So 23 IMF programs, and the sense that Pakistan could have imploded into a situation where people came on the streets like they did in Sri Lanka a while ago. That is something that is becoming clear to Pakistan's leaders. And what happened was that from 21, they also had a political crisis, a civil military crisis, and engendered by the broken marriage between the establishment and Imran Khan, as also a security crisis, because after 15th August 21, the Taliban and the TTP wasn't quite as advertised. They were not quite the friends Pakistan hoped to have to give it strategic depth. And all these crises came together to coalesce into a polycrisis, which made Pakistan talk about geoeconomics. So I think the talk of the primacy of geoeconomics as against geopolitics is essentially a cry to say that the economic policies of the past have not worked, and a realization that if the country falls into an economic downward spiral, it would not have the strength, the political or the military strength also to deal with its neighbors, and particularly with India. So I think it comes from that space. And I think, therefore, this talk about trade is something which is fairly serious. It's a balloon that's been floated, but it is something that Pakistan would like to take forward as a conversation in the second half of the year once India has a government in place. And if you see Pakistani discourse, they are very conscious of the fact that India has a troubled relationship also with China, with whom India has a trade of $130 billion. So their question is, why can't they also benefit from India doing trade with India, even or despite this adversarial relationship?
I want you to comment a little bit about the whole. We'll come back to Pakistan and India, but for a moment, let me take you to Pakistan and Iran, because that has really surprised many people in recent months and things that have been boiling on that border, so to speak. Considering what we know about Iran today, considering what's happening between Iran and Israel, between Iran and the United States, considering that many people today believe that Iran perhaps would be only months away from declaring itself a nuclear power. Taking all of these factors in mind, what do you really think is going on with the Iran-Pakistan relationship?
I think what we saw in the last week or so was a tactical adjustment between Pakistan and Iran, not a strategic reset. And I would say that it was a reaction to the original or the initial problem that they had, which is the hot pursuit of terrorism, the missile exchange, the reciprocal missiles exchange that Pakistan and Iran had, that Iran targeted some of the terrorists in Balochistan who had safe sanctuary, who it believed was targeting the folks in Iran. So the Jaish-e-Adal was targeted by Iran, and Pakistan did a reciprocal strike to set up a deterrent. And I think at some point it suited both countries to have to sort of de-escalate that situation very fast. And I think this visit was born of that, of Iran's president visiting Pakistan. Essentially, Iran sees the challenge of having opened several fronts with Iran, four fronts, if you will, the three proxy fronts as well as a direct front. And Pakistan, it's also sees a challenge of having opened a front with Afghanistan and the TTP. So both countries were keen to close this front, or at least have a tactical adjustment where they are not at each other's throat for in accusing each other of terrorism. To me, also, it established a very interesting principle that Pakistan considered it legitimate to pursue or get into the hot pursuit of terrorists in safe sanctuaries across its borders. That is what it accuses India of doing in the Balakot strikes. And that is what it accused the United States of doing when it took out Osama bin Laden. But now Pakistan was doing that itself. So I think a few interesting principles come up. But on the geopolitics of it, I think it's an adjustment by Iran and by Pakistan to ensure that at least one of their several fronts is calmer.
The interesting thing in all of this is, how would this access pan out? On one hand, there is a constant question that Russia and China are coming closer together. This is a fear that's expressed in many parts of the world, not least in our country. Uh, China and Pakistan are supposed to be all-weather friends. Some people in last couple of years have also suggested that Russia and Pakistan are coming closer, or at the very least are not as distant as they, you know, were thought to be. The entire region seems to be in a bit of a flux. How do you see these things play out?
Well, I think the China-Pakistan axis is well known. It was started as a strategic alliance in the 60s, and it's now a relationship of abject economic dependence on the part of Pakistan, even apart from the fact that the Pakistani missile program and nuclear program are all Chinese. But I would not give too much importance to the Russia-Pakistan axis because there are many issues there. Sometimes there is talk of a axis, an anti-Western axis in which Pakistan is being drawn in, which is Russia, China, and Iran. But I think that is very early days because Pakistan needs to balance its equities in the West as well. So Pakistan, while it has a relationship of huge dependency on China, is also trying to develop and retain its relationship with the United States because it sees many equities in the West, not least of which is the nod to the IMF program, and also the traditional trade with the United States. So I think for Pakistan, it is important not to be drawn into what is an overtly anti-West sort of strategic grouping. So I would discount that it is sometimes works with the Russians to make the point to the US by engaging with Pakistan and even trying to sell some weapons. But I think that is not a deeper strategic kind of cohabiting at this point.
I want to ask you, Ambassador. I was talking to Arup Raha about after the big attack of drone attack that Israel faced. And Air Marshal Raha made this interesting comment about the growing use of drones in such attacks, including, perhaps on India at some point. Now, the question is that, some people at least have speculated that some of these kind of drone attacks, as they grow, more advanced, are able to carry more weapons, could perhaps one day even carry a tactical nuclear weapon. Considering what we know about the history of Pakistan's use of tactical nuclear weapons, for which India developed an entire strategy, the Cold Star Doctrine, talk to us a little bit about how you see this advancement in armaments and the future of India-Pakistan conflict, especially a lot of it is bound to be airborne.
I'm no expert on tactical nuclear weapons or defense matters, but let me make the larger geopolitical argument. I think what we are seeing from Pakistan is an access that it has to drone technology, particularly Chinese drone technology, and the ability to use it in a limited way in the border with India. So that is something that Pakistan deploys. There are a lot of security experts, if you talk to in Jammu and Kashmir, who would argue that while cross-border movement of terrorists has reduced, the nature of the cross-border threat has changed in terms of drone drops of cash and drugs and even small weapons. So I think Pakistan has access to that technology. Now, when you talk of nuclear weapons, then we move into a completely different domain. And there, I think Pakistan has well-defined red lines and well-defined use of tactical nuclear weapons as part of what it calls its full spectrum deterrence. But that, I think, is clearly weapons of deterrence. And at this point of time, I don't see any first use threat or threshold that Pakistan would explicitly state. So I would discount the nuclearization of these weapons. But certainly, the drone technology exists, and that is something India's defense and military planners should be alive to.
want to return to this entire question of Khalistan, but before that, because you mentioned, drones and drugs and airdrops, talk to us a little bit about the use of drones and drugs, and because that seems to again be catching headlines consistently on various routes, airborne routes being developed to supply drugs to across the border to various places and drop points in India. How big a threat is that in your mind?
I would say that, the ISI's program of or Pakistan's program of exploiting the fissures in India, or trying to put its dagger in fault lines in India, is something that is a continuing strategy which hasn't dramatically changed. Now, you may have had a fall in cross-border infiltration, and that may be because of a certain deterrence being exhibited by India, or credible deterrence set up after Balakot and so on. There is a tendency to work beneath what Pakistan perceives as India's threshold of response. And certainly dropping drones or using drones to drop drugs and weapons is something which is seen as below that threshold. So I think that is something that India's security apparatus needs to examine, analyze, and develop counters for, both in the Punjab border and the Jammu and Kashmir border, or within Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. But also, to an extent, I believe in Rajasthan and other such places, that there needs to be an ability for India to counter this, because low-level infiltration using drones is something that we can expect to continue.
You mentioned that, a little while ago, this entire thing about Pakistan's desperate move from geopolitics to geoeconomics because of its perilous economic state and, in a sense, a cry for help. Some would say, Ambassador, that despite such a perilous state of affairs, in reality, Pakistan still believes that, it could, in a sense, not only have the upper hand with India, but also it seems to have rekindled and re-triggered the entire Khalistan issue across the world, from Australia to Canada to Britain and America. The Khalistan issue has been triggered again. So what kind of role do you think Pakistan today really is able to play, considering its own, economic situation and security situation, in rekindling? And why would it go through the process of rekindling the Khalistan issue? I mean, of course, some people say it is because, Kashmir is clearly a lost cause for them. But does it even have the resources to rekindle the Khalistan issue in any grand manner around the world?
Well, I would say that a reasonable conjecture there would be that it's a low-cost option, right? We saw that in the 80s, that Pakistan kindled the Khalistan cause and the Khalistani movement, and produced a fair degree of destabilization in India. So it could exploit a fault line in India at a time when it thought it had no comparable conventional forces to counter India. And perhaps in the 90s, it moved away from Punjab to Jammu and Kashmir, because that felt a ripe fruit that was about to fall into their lap, or was much more vulnerable. And somewhere along the line, perhaps a determination was made that Jammu and Kashmir is now being consolidated with India. There's not much scope, so this front should be opened up again. And it's a low-cost option because there's a global movement that can be pursued. In Canada, for instance, you would see Khalistani flags and Kashmir flags together. So often appeared that the same sponsors had got them to launch those protests. So I think it is something that again is part of the piece of working, trying to exploit India's fault lines, trying to revive something that could potentially internally destabilize India, and something that could be deployed globally. So there would be a strong Pakistani hand in this global movement, and I think that is well understood.
Right. Us a little bit now about CPEC. In your understanding, where does it stand today? It has clearly not had the kind of success that the Pakistanis certainly wanted to believe it would. Certainly, Chinese ambitions of it really fructifying and becoming a solid economic sort of pathway also hasn't happened. What do you think is the future of CPEC? The China-Pakistan economic corridor. Where do you see it going or not going?
Well, I see the future as very bleak. I don't see, I think it's clear to a lot of analysts, even within Pakistan. I remember headlines saying the CPEC is dead. And there is a lot of discourse around how the CPEC did not meet its original objectives. It was supposed to be a $64 billion program. It was supposed to have one leg going into Punjab, the other into Balochistan, up to Gwadar port. But clearly, those objectives have not been met. Part of the reason was that the kind of returns that China was expected were not coming. Part of the reason was the kind of scrutiny the West and the IMF was asking for of the CPEC programs when giving their loans, which had the Chinese very nervous about the kind of returns they were expecting. And of course, now is the security challenge, the killings of Chinese workers and engineers, particularly in Balochistan, which has made China do a rethink. So what was meant to be $64 billion went up to, I think, $22-24 billion, but it has definitely there is a pause in that. The rhetoric will continue, but I think the Chinese are re-examining the feasibility of continuing with this program, and I think so are the Pakistanis.
As we wind up our conversation, I cannot but ask you and make this conversation a little more personal about your experience of Pulwama, something that you write in great detail in your book. For many Indians, this was an epochal moment. In a sense, this was the moment that many had hoped would happen after the Mumbai attacks. It didn't at that time. And there are many arguments pro and, against on why it should have happened or shouldn't have happened. But Pulwama was a turning point, at least in many Indian minds. Talk to us a little bit about what you saw and felt, and what you think as history looks back at Pulwama, most importantly, Ambassador Bisaria. What will India's history look back at Pulwama and actually see? Will it see it as a turning point? Will it see it as a moment when India finally became, an active pursuant of coercive diplomacy against Pakistan? How will history read Pulwama?
I think it's 5 years after Pulwama, one can see that the Balakot response was certainly a response which India managed to set a credible deterrent to terrorism. It made sure that the message in a strategic calculus sense to Pakistan was that for the next Pulwama, there would be a Balakot plus response. And therefore, it is not a low-cost option to have plausibly deniable terrorism within India, using Pakistan-based militant organizations, because the Indian response now does not make a distinction between the Pakistani state and non-state actors, which it sees as sponsored and supported by Pakistani state actors. So for me, I think personally, it was satisfying that India used a response of coercive diplomacy And I see, as I said, the whole response as a piece, the surgical strikes of 2016 and the airstrikes, as a definition or a statement of both India's capacity and will to get into hot pursuit of terrorists and go into preemptive and punitive actions across the border. And I also make the point that perhaps this should have been done much sooner, perhaps in the 80s and 90s with the hard power, and certainly in the 2000s. And I also make the point that while the 2001 Parliament attack in India, we could make the argument that the countries were very freshly nuclear, and it wasn't clear where the nuclear red lines lay. So there was a nuclear responsible response of strategic restraint. In 2008, with Mumbai, that was not necessary. And that was a strategic error in not having the kind of proportionate response to the 2008 attack by having something of the sort we saw later in Balakot. So I think that was a strategic error. And this time, I think we have set up a credible deterrent. Whether it means that it deters terrorism for all times to come, certainly no. But it certainly sets up a deterrence to and increases the cost to the Pakistan army of adopting such a course.
Professor Ajay Bisaria, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations once again for your wonderful new book, Anger Management. You know, when I read your book, I was reminded of that old Indian parable of the monk and the cobra. The monk teaches the cobra that it's a bad thing to bite people. The cobra then stops biting, and then a week later, the monk finds it near dead and beaten up. And then the monk tells the cobra, I told you not to bite, but I did not tell you not to raise your hood. And when I was reading your book, I was reminded of that parable. Thank you for beautifully explaining this to us in your wonderful new book, Anger Management. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Hendolki. Great having this chat with you.